There are moments in life when you realize that a single question can unravel everything you thought you knew about your relationship. For me, that moment came on a Tuesday evening in March, sitting across from my wife at our kitchen table, when I casually asked if she'd ever had a crush before we got married. What I didn't know then was that this question would become the first domino in a chain reaction that would fundamentally alter not just our marriage, but my entire understanding of love, trust, and the dangerous territory between curiosity and obsession. I was 32 then, comfortable in what I believed was a transparent marriage. We'd been together for 8 years, married for 5, and I prided myself on our openness. We talked about everything, or so I thought. Our relationship had been built on a foundation of honesty that I considered unshakable. We'd weathered the usual storms of early marriage, financial stress when I was between jobs for 6 months, the loss of her father to cancer 3 years prior, the miscarriage we'd experienced in our second year of marriage that had brought us closer together through shared grief. Through all of these challenges, communication had been our strength. We processed emotions together, made decisions as a team, and maintained what I believed was complete transparency about our thoughts, feelings, and desires. I knew her morning routine down to the exact order in which she applied her skincare products. I knew that she preferred her coffee exactly 3 minutes after it finished brewing, that she always read the ending of books first when she was anxious about the plot, and that she had a recurring dream about being late for a college exam despite having graduated nearly a decade earlier. This level of intimate knowledge extended to our physical relationship as well. We'd been each other's primary sexual partners, having met in our early 20s when neither of us had extensive romantic histories. Our physical connection had developed organically over the years, moving from the nervous excitement of new love through the comfortable passion of established partnership. We'd experimented together, learned each other's preferences, and built a sexual relationship that I considered both satisfying and emotionally connected. But despite all of this apparent openness, I realized now that there were territories we'd never explored, questions we'd never asked, assumptions we'd never examined. The question about past crushes came from nowhere, really. Maybe it was the wine we'd shared with dinner. Maybe it was the romantic comedy we'd watched that afternoon where the female protagonist reminisced about her high school sweetheart, but something made me curious about her past in a way I'd never been before. The setting was mundane enough: our small kitchen table, the remains of Tuesday night pasta still on our plates, the sound of our neighbor's television filtering through the thin walls of our apartment. She was scrolling through her phone, probably checking social media or responding to work emails, when I asked the question that would change everything. Her initial response was immediate and firm, delivered without even looking up from her screen. No, she said. She'd never had feelings for anyone else, not before me, not during our relationship. The conviction in her voice was absolute, almost dismissive of the very possibility. She seemed almost offended by the suggestion, as if I'd implied some kind of betrayal simply by wondering about her romantic history. But something in her response didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the speed of her denial, or the way she still hadn't looked up from her phone, or perhaps just an intuition born from years of knowing someone intimately. There was something performative about her certainty, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as me. I remember leaning back in my chair, studying her face in the warm light of our kitchen lamp. I tried to sound casual, reassuring rather than interrogative. I told her it was perfectly normal to have had crushes, that I wouldn't judge her, that I was just curious about her experiences before we met. I shared a story about my own teenage infatuation with a girl from my high school math class, trying to create a safe space for her to reciprocate. The kitchen grew quiet except for the familiar sounds of our evening routine, the hum of our refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic from the street below, the soft tick of the wall clock her mother had given us as a wedding gift. I watched as her resolve slowly crumbled, her fingers stilling on her phone screen, her eyes finally meeting mine with an expression I'd rarely seen, a mixture of guilt and resignation. It took another 20 minutes of gentle coaxing before she finally admitted there had been someone. The admission came in fragments, reluctant pieces of information that I had to carefully extract through patient questioning. A guy from her 12th grade coaching sessions. She'd been preparing for college entrance exams, and he was one of her tutors. She was quick to minimize it, calling it nothing more than a silly teenage infatuation, something that meant nothing in the grand scheme of her life. But as she talked, more details emerged. He was older, maybe 24 to her 17, a graduate student who supplemented his income by tutoring high school students. He was studying literature, she said, with a focus on contemporary poetry. He had this way of explaining complex concepts that made her feel intelligent and sophisticated, like she was capable of understanding things beyond her years. The coaching sessions lasted for 6 months, meeting twice a week in the library of her high school. She described him as having dark hair that was always slightly disheveled, wire-rimmed glasses that he would take off and clean obsessively when he was thinking, and a habit of wearing the same brown leather jacket regardless of the weather. He drove an old Honda Civic with a collection of literary magazines scattered across the passenger seat, and he always smelled like coffee and something else she couldn't identify, perhaps the particular scent of old books and pencil shavings that clung to serious students. The way she spoke about him, even years later, was different from how she talked about other people from her past. There was a warmth in her voice, a softness around her eyes, that suggested these memories held a special place in her consciousness. She told me that he had once lent her a book of poetry, Pablo Neruda, she thought, and that she'd kept it for months after the tutoring sessions ended, reading it over and over until she'd memorized several of the poems. What struck me most was not just that she'd had feelings for someone else, but that she'd never mentioned him in all our years together. In our countless conversations about our pasts, our formative experiences, the people and events that had shaped us, this significant figure had never come up. It wasn't that she'd lied exactly, but she'd engaged in a form of omission that felt almost like deception. I should have left it there. That admission should have been enough to satisfy my curiosity and allow us to move on. But something about the way she described him, the careful way she chose her words, the slight flush in her cheeks, the distant look in her eyes as she recalled those afternoons in the library, planted a seed that would grow into something I never could have anticipated. The weeks that followed were strange and unsettling. I found myself thinking about this mystery figure from her past more than I cared to admit. Who was he? What did he look like beyond her basic description? What had attracted her to him specifically? Had anything ever happened between them beyond the professional tutoring relationship? These questions circled in my mind during quiet moments at work, during my commute home, even during conversations with friends who had no idea what I was processing internally. I began to notice things about my wife that I'd never paid attention to before. When she read poetry, which she did occasionally, I wondered if she was thinking about him. When she mentioned enjoying a particular book or author, I found myself wondering if he had influenced her taste. When she seemed distracted or lost in thought, I caught myself wondering if she might be remembering those afternoons in the library. This newfound awareness created a strange paranoia that I struggled to understand or control. I had always considered myself a confident, secure person, but suddenly I found myself analyzing innocent interactions and comments for hidden meanings. When she mentioned that a colleague reminded her of someone from her past, I wondered if she meant him. When she seemed particularly engaged with a piece of literature or poetry, I found myself questioning whether it triggered memories of their time together. Around this same period, my wife and I began spending more time apart due to work commitments. She'd taken on a project that required frequent travel to our company's regional offices, often leaving on Monday morning and not returning until Thursday or Friday evening. Meanwhile, I was working longer hours to cover for a colleague who had taken extended medical leave following a serious car accident. Our schedules, which had been naturally synchronized for years, suddenly became completely misaligned. The physical separation was difficult for both of us. We'd grown accustomed to sharing daily routines: morning coffee, evening walks, weekend grocery shopping, the countless small interactions that create intimacy in long-term relationships. Suddenly, we were communicating primarily through text messages and brief phone calls, trying to maintain connection across distance and competing schedules. Our physical intimacy, which had always been a cornerstone of our relationship, was reduced to stolen moments between flights and late-night returns from the office. When we were together, we were often exhausted, focused on practical matters like paying bills, doing laundry, and preparing for the next separation. The spontaneous affection and regular physical connection that had characterized our relationship began to feel like luxuries we couldn't afford. It was during one of these periods of separation that we started having more intimate phone conversations. What began as simple expressions of missing each other gradually evolved into something more sexually charged. I'm not sure who initiated it first. These things tend to develop organically, but soon we were engaging in elaborate fantasies over the phone, describing scenarios and desires with a freedom that surprised both of us. The phone seemed to strip away inhibitions that we'd somehow developed in person over the years. Maybe it was the anonymity of voices in the dark, or maybe it was the safety of physical distance, but we began exploring territories of desire that we'd never ventured into during our years together. She would describe what she wanted me to do to her, and I would respond with increasingly detailed scenarios of my own. These conversations became a highlight of our weeks apart. We would schedule calls for late evening, after work obligations were finished, and spend hours exploring fantasies that ranged from romantic to explicitly sexual. The distance that had initially felt like a barrier to intimacy became a catalyst for a new kind of connection, one that was purely mental and emotional. But it was also during these calls that my curiosity about her past began to merge with our present intimate life in ways I didn't initially recognize as problematic. I found myself wondering, during our most heated conversations, whether she was thinking about him. The question that had started as innocent curiosity about her romantic history began to evolve into something more invasive and obsessive. It was during one of these calls, about 3 weeks after her initial confession about the tutor, that I made what I now recognize as the first truly destructive decision of our marriage. We were in the middle of describing a particularly intense scenario, and I could hear her breathing become more rapid on the other end of the line. In that moment, driven by some compulsion I still don't fully understand, I suggested she imagine it was him instead of me. The silence that followed stretched for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. I could hear her breathing, but she said nothing. When she finally responded, her voice had changed, become smaller, more uncertain. She asked me if I was serious, if I really wanted her to think about someone else during our intimate moments. I convinced myself in that moment that this was healthy experimentation, that fantasy was separate from reality, that this could even enhance our relationship by introducing an element of novelty and excitement. I told her it was just pretend, just a game, that it might make things more intense for both of us. I drew on half-remembered articles I'd read about couples who successfully incorporated fantasy into their relationships, about the importance of mental stimulation in maintaining long-term sexual satisfaction. Her reluctance was obvious, but I interpreted it as shyness rather than genuine discomfort. She said she didn't think she could do that it felt wrong to think about someone else while we were being intimate, even if it was just over the phone. But I persisted, explaining that it was just imagination, that it didn't mean anything real, that it was no different from the fantasies we'd already been sharing. Eventually, she agreed to try it, though her agreement felt more like capitulation than enthusiasm. What followed was a gradual descent into a dynamic that I now realize was fundamentally unhealthy, though it took months for me to understand the full implications of what we'd started. Over the course of several phone conversations, I found myself not just suggesting but actively encouraging her to incorporate this other man into her fantasies. I would ask her to describe what she was imagining, to tell me where her mind was going during our most intimate exchanges. I became increasingly specific in my requests, asking her to imagine particular scenarios, particular positions, particular dynamics between herself and this figure from her past. Her responses were initially hesitant, almost clinical. She would mention him briefly, as if checking a box to satisfy my requests, then quickly redirect the fantasy back to us. But I pushed for more details, more involvement, more of him in her mental landscape. I told myself this was about exploring boundaries, about keeping our relationship exciting and dynamic, about maintaining the kind of openness and honesty that I believed was essential to a healthy marriage. What I didn't recognize at the time was that I was essentially training my wife to be unfaithful in her imagination. Every time I encouraged her to think about him, every time I asked for more details about her fantasies involving him, I was reinforcing a pattern of mental infidelity that would eventually become impossible to undo. The psychological mechanisms at work were complex and, in retrospect, predictable. By repeatedly asking her to imagine someone else during our intimate moments, I was creating a neural pathway that connected her sexual arousal with thoughts of another man. The more this happened, the more natural and automatic it became. What started as a reluctant exercise in imagination gradually became a habit, and eventually, a necessity. But I was too caught up in the immediate excitement of our enhanced phone conversations to recognize the long-term consequences of what we were doing. The fantasy element did make our conversations more intense, more vivid, more arousing. There was something thrilling about the transgressive nature of what we were doing, something that felt edgy and adventurous in a way our relationship had never been before. I began to look forward to these calls with an anticipation that felt almost addictive. During the day, I would think about what scenarios we might explore that evening, what new territory we might venture into. The mundane realities of work and daily life became background noise to the more exciting prospect of our nighttime conversations. The real shift happened when we were finally reunited after a particularly long separation, nearly 2 weeks during which we'd had several of these fantasy-enhanced phone conversations. The anticipation had been building for weeks, and I expected our physical reunion to be explosive. It was, but not in the way I had imagined. Somewhere in the heat of that first night back together, I found myself asking her, while we were actually making love, to imagine he was there instead of me. The words came out before I fully processed what I was saying, driven by some compulsion that had been building during our time apart. She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of confusion and something that might have been fear. But she complied. And in that moment, I realized that what had felt like harmless fantasy over the phone had become something much more significant when translated into our physical relationship. The distance that had made the fantasy feel safe and abstract was gone, replaced by the immediate reality of our bodies together while her mind was elsewhere. That compliance became a regular feature of our intimate life over the following months. What had started as an occasional request during phone conversations evolved into a persistent element of our physical relationship. I found myself asking her to imagine him not just during phone calls, but during foreplay, during sex, during the quiet moments afterward when we lay together in the dark. I developed an almost obsessive need to know when she was thinking about him and when she wasn't. This need manifested in constant questioning that became increasingly invasive and persistent. During foreplay, I would ask her to tell me what she was thinking about. During sex, I would ask her to describe her fantasies. During the quiet moments afterward, I would ask her to recount where her mind had been during our intimate encounter. I framed these questions as curiosity, as a desire for honesty and openness in our relationship, but I was really seeking something I couldn't name, perhaps reassurance, perhaps the thrill of transgression, perhaps simply the confirmation of my own worst fears. The questioning became compulsive, driven by an anxiety that I couldn't control or understand. What I learned during those months fundamentally changed how I understood both my wife and myself. She began to admit, with increasing frequency, that she was indeed imagining him during many of our intimate moments. But more disturbing were the specifics of when and why she was doing so. She told me that she primarily imagined him during our rougher encounters, when I was more aggressive, more demanding physically. When I asked her to explain this pattern, she initially resisted, saying it didn't matter, that it was just fantasy. But I persisted, driven by a need to understand that had become more important to me than her comfort or privacy. Her explanation, when I finally pressed her for one, cut deeper than anything she could have said about love or attraction. She said she imagined him because I wouldn't want to see her in pain, that she could only access certain kinds of physical intensity by mentally separating the emotional connection she had with me from the physical sensations she was experiencing. The implications of this revelation unraveled me completely. Not only was she regularly fantasizing about another man during our most intimate moments, but she was doing so specifically because she felt I couldn't or wouldn't give her what she actually wanted physically. The man I had introduced as a fantasy figure had become, in her mind, more capable of satisfying certain desires than I was. This realization forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about our sexual relationship that I had been avoiding for years. Had I been too gentle, too considerate, too focused on her emotional comfort at the expense of physical intensity? Had my desire to be a loving, respectful partner actually prevented me from being the kind of lover she truly wanted? I began to analyze our entire sexual history through this new lens. Moments that I had interpreted as tenderness and emotional connection now seemed like missed opportunities for greater physical intensity. Times when I had held back, when I had been careful not to be too rough or demanding, now felt like failures to meet her actual needs and desires. The psychological impact of this revelation extended far beyond our bedroom. I began to question my own adequacy as a man, as a lover, as a partner. If she needed to imagine someone else to access certain kinds of physical pleasure, what did that say about my capabilities? If she had never volunteered this information, if it had taken months of persistent questioning to extract these truths, what else might she be concealing? I spent weeks trying to process this information, but the more I thought about it, the more disturbed I became. During the day, I would function normally, going to work, having conversations with colleagues, maintaining the routine of daily life. But underneath, I was constantly analyzing every interaction with my wife, every moment of physical intimacy, every casual touch or kiss. I found myself wondering, during the most mundane moments, whether she was thinking about him then too. When she seemed distracted during dinner, was she remembering their time together? When she smiled at something on her phone, was she imagining him? When she seemed particularly affectionate or physically responsive, was it because she was mentally replacing me with him? The worst part was the gradual realization that she had never volunteered this information. Every revelation had come only after I had specifically asked, sometimes repeatedly, sometimes aggressively. This meant that without my persistent questioning, she would have been content to continue this mental infidelity indefinitely without ever acknowledging it. The thought that I might have lived the rest of my life unknowingly serving as a physical substitute for her real desires was almost unbearable. How many times had we made love while she was thinking about him? How many moments that I had treasured as genuine intimacy had actually been elaborate deceptions, with her body present but her mind elsewhere? I began to notice changes in how we interacted physically. Where I had once felt confident and present during intimate moments, I now found myself constantly distracted by questions about where her mind was. I would find myself analyzing her expressions, her responses, her body language, trying to detect whether she was mentally with me or with him. The spontaneity and natural flow that had characterized our physical relationship for years disappeared entirely. Every touch, every kiss, every moment of physical connection became an opportunity for analysis rather than genuine experience. I couldn't be present in my own body because I was too busy trying to figure out where her mind was. Our conversations about this became increasingly frequent and increasingly painful. I would bring up the subject at inappropriate times during dinner, while watching television, during car rides, compulsively seeking reassurance that I never actually received. The more I asked, the more defensive she became, and the more defensive she became, the more convinced I was that she was hiding something even more significant. She grew tired of the questions, understandably, but her irritation only convinced me further that she was concealing the full extent of her mental infidelity. When she refused to answer my questions, I interpreted it as guilt. When she tried to change the subject, I saw it as avoidance. When she expressed frustration with my persistent questioning, I heard it as anger at being caught. The dynamic that emerged was toxic for both of us. I became suspicious and insecure in ways I had never been before, constantly seeking confirmation of fears that I simultaneously hoped were unfounded. She became defensive and eventually resentful, feeling judged for fantasies that I had originally encouraged. We were trapped in a cycle of my asking questions she didn't want to answer about thoughts I had originally asked her to have. I started researching online, spending hours reading forums and articles about fantasy and relationships, about emotional infidelity, about the boundaries between imagination and betrayal. The information I found was contradictory and ultimately unhelpful. Some sources insisted that fantasy was completely separate from reality and posed no threat to relationships. Others suggested that persistent fantasy about specific individuals, especially from one's past, represented a form of emotional cheating that could be just as damaging as physical infidelity. The ambiguity of the situation was perhaps the most difficult aspect to handle. I couldn't point to any concrete betrayal. She hadn't contacted this person, hadn't sought him out, hadn't even spoken about him except when I specifically asked. But the knowledge that he occupied space in her mind during our most intimate moments felt like a profound violation of our relationship. I began to understand that I had created this situation entirely through my own actions. My curiosity about her past, my introduction of him into our fantasies, my persistent questioning about her thoughts, every step of this destructive path had been initiated by me. This realization brought with it a crushing sense of responsibility and regret, but also a confusing anger that she had so readily embraced something that ultimately damaged our connection. The psychological complexity of being simultaneously the victim and the perpetrator of my own betrayal was overwhelming. I was angry at her for thinking about him, but I was the one who had asked her to do so. I felt betrayed by her mental infidelity, but I was the one who had encouraged it. I was hurt by her dishonesty, but I was the one who had created the conditions that made honesty feel impossible. Months passed with this tension underlying every interaction between us. We still functioned as a couple in public, still maintained the routines of married life, still shared meals and conversations and daily responsibilities. But the foundation of trust and emotional safety that had supported our relationship for years had been fundamentally compromised. I found myself grieving for the relationship we had lost, even though we were still together. The easy intimacy, the assumption of mutual presence and attention during physical connection, the sense that we were each other's primary source of desire and fantasy, all of this had been replaced by questions, suspicions, and the persistent awareness of another person's presence in our most private moments. The psychological impact extended far beyond our bedroom. I began to question my own adequacy in ways I never had before. If she needed to imagine someone else to access certain kinds of physical intensity, what did that say about my capabilities as a lover? If she had never volunteered the information about her fantasies, what else might she be concealing? If I had inadvertently revealed such a profound need in her, What other needs was I failing to meet? Sleep became difficult during this period. I would lie awake next to her, wondering what she was thinking about as she drifted off, whether images of him accompanied her into sleep. I became hyper-aware of her expressions during the day, analyzing them for signs of distraction or mental absence. Every moment of physical affection became an opportunity for analysis rather than genuine connection. The irony of the situation was not lost on me. In seeking to enhance our relationship through exploration and openness, I had instead introduced an element that made genuine intimacy nearly impossible. The very transparency I had insisted upon had revealed truths that I was emotionally unprepared to handle. Friends and family began to notice changes in my behavior, though I couldn't bring myself to explain what was happening. How do you tell people that your marriage is struggling because you convinced your wife to fantasize about another man and then couldn't handle the consequences? The situation felt too complex, too embarrassing, and too self-inflicted to share with anyone. My closest friend, Mark, who had been my best man at our wedding, commented during a weekend gathering that I seemed distracted and distant. When he asked if everything was okay at home, I found myself unable to formulate a response that didn't sound completely insane. I told him we were going through a rough patch, which was true enough, but I couldn't explain the nature of our difficulties without revealing the full extent of my own role in creating them. My parents, who lived several hours away but visited monthly, also noticed changes in our dynamic. My mother, who had always praised our communication and obvious affection for each other, mentioned to my wife that we seemed less connected than usual. This observation, relayed to me later, felt like confirmation that our problems were visible to others, even when we thought we were maintaining appearances. I considered therapy, both individual and couples counseling, but I was paralyzed by the prospect of explaining this situation to a professional. The idea of sitting in an office and recounting how I had systematically encouraged my wife to fantasize about another man seemed too humiliating to contemplate. Part of me hoped that time would somehow resolve the issue, that the intensity of my feelings would fade and we could return to some version of our previous dynamic. But as months passed without any natural resolution, I began to realize that this was not the kind of problem that would solve itself. The knowledge I had gained had fundamentally altered our relationship, and no amount of time was going to erase what I had learned. We were both trapped in a dynamic that neither of us had wanted but that we seemed unable to escape. The holidays that year were particularly difficult. We had always enjoyed the season together, finding joy in the traditions we'd established and the time we could spend with family and friends. But that year, every moment of required intimacy felt performative rather than genuine. Thanksgiving dinner at my parents' house was an exercise in careful acting. We held hands during grace, kissed briefly when we arrived and departed, and maintained the kind of casual physical affection that had always been natural between us. But I found myself wondering, during every moment of contact, whether she was thinking about him. When she laughed at my father's jokes, when she helped my mother in the kitchen, when she participated in our family's traditional post-dinner walk, I couldn't shake the feeling that part of her mind was elsewhere. Christmas was even more challenging. The exchange of gifts, which had always been a source of joy and connection between us, felt hollow and obligatory. I had bought her a necklace that I thought she would love, but when she opened it, her smile seemed forced and her gratitude felt performed. The kiss she gave me in thanks was brief and distracted, and I found myself wondering if she was imagining giving that kiss to someone else. We spent Christmas Eve at her mother's house, sleeping in the same guest room we'd shared for years. But lying next to her in that narrow bed, listening to her breathe in the darkness, I felt like I was sleeping next to a stranger. The physical proximity that had once been comforting now felt like a mockery of real intimacy. By the new year, I had to confront the reality that this situation was not resolving itself. The knowledge I had sought had fundamentally altered our relationship, and no amount of time was going to erase what I had learned. We were both trapped in a dynamic that neither of us had wanted but that we seemed unable to escape. I began to notice that our conversations had become superficial and careful. We talked about work, about practical matters, about current events, but we avoided the deeper emotional territory that had once been the foundation of our connection. I found myself editing my thoughts before I spoke, unsure what topics might lead back to the subject that had become so painful for both of us. She seemed to be doing the same thing. Where she had once shared her thoughts and feelings freely, she now seemed guarded and cautious. Our conversations felt like negotiations rather than genuine exchanges, with both of us trying to avoid saying anything that might trigger another painful discussion about fantasies and faithfulness. The most painful realization was that I had lost something I hadn't even known I valued until it was gone. The assumption of mental fidelity, the sense that we were each other's primary objects of desire and fantasy, the confidence that our intimate moments were genuinely shared experiences, these had been casualties of my curiosity and my insistence on absolute honesty. I began to understand that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. Some knowledge, once gained, cannot be unknown. Some questions, once asked, change the fundamental nature of what they seek to understand. I had asked my wife to share her fantasies, and she had complied, but in doing so we had both lost something essential about our connection. The weight of this realization was crushing. I had essentially destroyed the very thing I had been trying to protect and enhance. In my quest for complete honesty and openness, I had uncovered truths that made genuine intimacy nearly impossible. The transparency I had insisted upon had revealed the limitations of transparency itself. Now, months later, I find myself in a position I never could have imagined when I first asked that seemingly innocent question about past crushes. I love my wife deeply, but I feel like a stranger in my own marriage. I am physically present but emotionally distant, going through the motions of intimacy while feeling fundamentally disconnected from the experience. The question that haunts me now is whether it's possible to rebuild what we've lost. Can trust be restored when the betrayal was essentially invited? Can intimacy be genuine when you know your partner's mind is elsewhere? Can a relationship recover from total honesty when that honesty reveals truths that undermine the foundation of the connection? These questions have no easy answers, and I've spent countless hours considering them from every angle. I've read books about relationships, about fantasy and fidelity, about the psychology of desire and attachment. I've analyzed our situation through every framework I can find, looking for some path forward that doesn't require either accepting a fundamentally compromised relationship or ending a marriage that still has so much love at its core. The complexity of our situation defies simple solutions. We are not dealing with a traditional betrayal that can be addressed through forgiveness and rebuilding trust. We are dealing with the consequences of knowledge that cannot be unknown, of questions that cannot be unasked, of a dynamic that was created through mutual participation but that neither of us ultimately wanted. I don't have answers to these questions. What I have is the recognition that I opened a door that perhaps should have remained closed, asked questions that perhaps should never have been asked, and insisted on a transparency that neither of us was prepared to handle. The story of how I destroyed my own marriage through curiosity and the pursuit of openness is not one I ever expected to be telling, but it's the story I'm living now. The hollow feeling that accompanies this realization is perhaps the most accurate description of where I find myself. Not angry, exactly, though anger comes and goes in waves. Not heartbroken in the traditional sense, because nothing has technically ended. Just hollow, like something essential has been removed from the center of what we built together, leaving the structure standing but fundamentally changed. I still don't know if what happened constitutes emotional cheating, or if my reaction is an overreaction to a situation I created. I don't know if other couples navigate these waters more successfully, or if my experience is representative of what happens when curiosity overcomes wisdom in matters of the heart. What I know is that I am a different person than I was before I asked that first question, and we are a different couple than we were before I insisted on complete honesty about the landscapes of imagination and desire. Whether this story has a redemptive ending remains to be seen. Whether love and commitment can overcome the knowledge that has come between us is still an open question. What is certain is that the man who casually asked his wife about past crushes over dinner no longer exists, and the marriage we had before that conversation is gone forever. What we build from here will be something entirely new, shaped by hard-won wisdom about the dangerous power of questions we think we want answered. The journey forward, if there is one, will require both of us to find ways to live with knowledge that has fundamentally altered our understanding of our relationship. It will require me to find peace with the fact that I created the very situation that causes me such pain. It will require her to find ways to be present with me while managing the mental habits that my own encouragement helped to establish. Perhaps most difficult of all, it will require both of us to rebuild intimacy in the shadow of this knowledge, to find ways to connect genuinely while accepting that the innocence of our earlier relationship can never be recovered. The question is not whether we can return to what we had, but whether we can create something new that acknowledges the complexity of human desire while still preserving the love and commitment that brought us together in the first place. This is the story I never expected to tell, the cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing absolute honesty in relationships. It is a story about the unintended consequences of curiosity, about the difference between fantasy and reality, and about the price of knowledge that perhaps should have remained unknown. It is the story of how a single question can change everything, and how the pursuit of openness can sometimes lead to the very distance it seeks to overcome.